So, Valle, we are actually back in Venice, where we were a little bit more than 10 years ago, 2009. We did a release with a special issue that was about the Venice School.
Yeah.
So it's been a while, and I thought that maybe it's time to do an updated sort of SITESPEAK about it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, what was the Venice School and why was it important?
I mean, the Venice School was, it's an institution, the Institute of Architecture and Urbanism in Venice, which is a architecture school and a kind of design school. But when we speak about specifically about the Venice School, it's more like a group of intellectuals that would develop a kind of critical theory of modernist architecture. And there were several people involved with that, but I think the most prominent ones were Juan-Pedro Tafuri, who was the great historian, then Massimo Cacciari, who was a philosopher, who also on and off was a mayor of the city of Venice, in fact. But I think Tafuri, I've always been fascinated by him, so I've written a lot about him. I was trying to get together a book, which will probably not happen. But Tafuri is like, for me, he is like the idea of what a critical theory of architecture would be. And he began, he wrote on contemporary architecture, on modernism, he wrote on Renaissance architecture. In fact, he ended up writing mostly about Renaissance architecture. But his first book was out in 1968. It was called Theories, plural, Theories and History of Architecture. So the idea was that you have all these theories that he called operative history that would scan the past for solutions to solve contemporary social problems. Then there was the idea of a critical history that would somehow explore and excavate the contradictions of architecture in the emergence of capitalism. So he would oppose a critical history, critical historiography to what he calls the operative history, which he found in the great predecessors like Nicholas Pevsner and Siegfried Gideon and others. So he wanted to remodel architectural history. And that book was a confusing book. It's very difficult and weird. And he said that he wrote it for himself and he didn't expect anyone to understand it. And it's a pretty weird book. And he said he was surprised when he saw that book was in the bookshelves of all the architectural schools over Europe. He said, how can you understand this book? It's just weird. But I think this book has the claim that we need somehow to rethink the history of modernist architecture. But the problem then being that he ended up with this sharp division between history, which is critical, and the history which is projective or operative. And so history really cannot help you to do any kind of architecture. And the book ended up with the kind of the Bertolt Brechtian claim that the only architecture that is possible would be architecture of complete estrangement, that will somehow refuse to engage with the world. A sublime uselessness, he would say later on, which is of course a perhaps not so productive attitude. But still, this book is very, very interesting. But the year after, he produced a more systematic essay, which is called Towards a Critique of Architectural Ideology. And I think per una critica dell'ideologia architettonica, and he published that in an avant-garde magazine called Contropiano. And that's very significant because he was opposing the idea of planning. Planning is somehow the instrument of capitalism. You plan cycles of production, of habitation, of living, and architecture becomes a part of that big planning machine. So he wanted to trace the history of planning from the late Enlightenment, or from the mid-Enlightenment, the mid-18th century, to the present, where architecture would be finally swallowed up by capitalism. And this whole image of this dream of architecture somehow being possible, would be dispelled. And then he transformed that into a book, a long book, which is called Project and Utopia, which most people read in English, and unfortunately, the title is mistranslated. It's called Architecture and Utopia. Italian is Progetto e Utopia. So he says the architectural project, the idea of projecting a future, is the true problem. So architecture has always, from the late Enlightenment and onwards, being involved in this projection of a utopian future, and that needs to be dispelled, he said. But he traces this dialectic from the mid-18th century to the present. He says that modernism ends somehow in the 1930s. After that, the illusion was gone, and it can only somehow live on as a kind of perpetuated bad faith. Do you think that architecture could actually solve the problems? And of course, this was read by many theorists and historians, but architectures were a bit disappointed because there's really no future. And there is, on the English translation, there is a drawing by Aldo Rossi, a great Italian architect and designer, which is called Architecture Assassinated, L'Architecture Assassinée. People were saying that he somehow killed off architecture. I don't think he did, but I mean, Tafuri there's a certain sublime gloom because he loves to project these somber visions of the future, but still. So that book was out in 1973, I think, 1973. It ended in a pretty negative conclusion. But then he began to work together with Cacciari, with the school more, and he wrote what I think is one of the absolutely most fascinating stories of modern architecture, which was out in 1976, together with Francesco Dacco, which is called Modern Architecture. It's a really idiosyncratic history, but it's much more open-ended than the earlier books, and it really shows there is no one ending point to modernism. It ends in various ways. It speaks of Mies van der Rohe, which we talked about earlier in Berlin, about the tragedy of the Sigrun building. But he has all these complex ideas about how modernism ends. So I think as he moved onwards, he somehow became more aware of the fact that there is no one ending. It can go in many directions. And this last big book on modernism was out in 1980 called The Sphere and the Labyrinth. And there he has this idea that there are two versions of how you can think architecture. You can either enter into the sphere, which is this pristine view from above, where you enter geometric clarity, and then you can also enter into the labyrinth and somehow lose yourself in the maze of things. And I think he more and more opted for the labyrinth.
Yeah, sounds like that.
And he has this fabulous preface there, which is called The Historical Project, Il Progetto Storico, where he says that first there was this crisis of the project. The project, the projection of the future for the late 18th century became more and more problematic until it ended somewhere in the 1930s. Then he shifts that and says we need to move from crisis of the project to the project of crisis. That is the theoretical project to create a crisis in architecture, which is both theoretical and practical. So in some sense, this critical theory turned against itself. And somewhere in 1980, I think he wasn't really sure where it was going. So this book is equally weird as the first book in '68, but it's not negative, it's just very open-ended. So I think Tafuri is like a big toolbox. You can find virtually anything in him. That's why I'm so fascinated by him, because you can always find new things in him. So.
And there was a lot of people who picked up on Tafuri's theories and
he
thoughts.
Was. I mean, there's a strange
that's
story.
That's why it's a school.
I mean, there's this strange liaison that occurred between New York, architects like Peter Eisenman and others in the New York scene, the avant-garde scene, and the Italian Marxists around Tafuri, which was, of course, a very odd couple. The American formalists and the Italian Marxists. But he was very much appreciated in the U.S. He was translated. I don't think people really understood or wanted to hear about his Marxist connections, but they really picked up this idea that he says that if I prefer something, is this sublime uselessness, the idea of an avant-garde architecture that really negates everything related to building, dwelling, inhabiting social life, which was only an aside for him. But so there's this weird connection New York-Venice, I think, which also made the Venice School into an international phenomenon. All the translations began to appear. But then, of course, there were all these critiques of him, because Larocque said, we don't need this. No, we don't need this negative attitude. We need a history which is operative, which is creative. We need to scan the past for solutions for current problems. So there's been a lot of negative attitudes about Tafuri, but I think it's of course, there's a point there, but I think there's no necessity to read him in that way. So in that sense, I would compare him perhaps to Adorno, which is now also something I'm working with. Because Adorno would say that, the past is full of contradictions, and no work is able to solve the contradictions. But what it can do is that it can embody them and make them visible, and perhaps exacerbate them and make them even more intense. And doing that is something that occurs in the present, because it is present works that, as it were, unlock the complexity of the past. And that's of course a kind of operative history. We don't look to the past for solutions, but we look to the past in order to extricate even new problems that we, as Adorno would say, it's when you listen to Schoenberg's music that you understand the problems in Beethoven. So in that sense, it's when you look at contemporary architecture, you can understand the problems of early architecture. So in that sense, it's not negative, but it's more like a loop where the present touches the past and the past touches the present, which I think is a different way of being operative, because I think any writing of history will of course be operative, because you write history in order to say something about the present. That Tafuri was deeply involved in the present, so this reaction of him, I think, is not just. There are of course a lot of problems in Tafuri. There's a lot of anxiety in Tafuri, of course, but I think he's still a great writer, and he deserves to be read. You know, perhaps not taken literally, but he's always a source of inspiration for me. That's why I want to write a book about him, which I would probably won't do, but still. So I mean, he's still very important.
But how is it picked up today? Is it?
Of course, he's picked up by historians, because I mean, in the sense that he's I mean, now we're speaking about his interpretation of modernism. There's also these incredibly detailed writings about the city of Venice, about each building, you know, and each stone is to be interpreted and torn apart. So he's incredibly philologically precise historian. So architecture historians read him. I'm not sure whether contemporary architects read him, because they say, okay, this is art history, architectural history. And some people have said that there are like two strands in his thought. One is critical about the present, and he gave up writing about the present in 1984, basically, and then he just wrote about history. So there are two strands in him, but I think they are connected. I'm not really sure how, but you know, this is incredibly precise, minute analysis of buildings in Venice from the Renaissance. It is pretty much the same attitude. It is also a project of crisis, of understanding the complexity of each work and see how it is embedded in history and politics and economy, but also architectural details. So in that sense, it's also a great model to think about contemporary architecture.
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, Tafuri he will always remain. I think he's the greatest historian of architecture in the 20th century. I see no match for him in that sense. But then, of course, he's very problematic. But if you compare him to other historians, like, you know, the great modernists like Gideon or Zevi or Pevsner, they seem naive in comparison, because he's so subtle and so complex, and perhaps that's why people really don't know what to do with him. You know, you read him, this is incredibly good, but what are we going to do with this? And he says at one point in the first book that you have an existential choice somehow. You can look at all these things and understand them, but then the choice, the moment you decide to do something, cannot be deduced from history. You have to make a choice. And I think that's still a valid point. I mean, you can know everything about history, but it won't tell you what to do. No. Perhaps this division that he marked too strongly signals precisely that. You can learn from history, but it cannot tell you where you should go.
I mean, it was a pretty turbulent time in Italy at the point. I mean,
absolutely,
starting from '68.
Yeah, absolutely, and so there are all these political implications. The whole movement called Operaista movement, you know, the idea about autonomy, and many of his pupils went in that direction. I'm not sure whether Tafuri was so directly involved in practical politics, but a lot of his students were, you know, and they went off in all directions. So of course, it's a very turbulent time.
Definitely,
yeah. So yeah, but I mean, what can I say more about Tafuri? I think I think if you read his books in chronological order, you can see a certain development, and I think what interested me the most, and there's a chapter in my book which deals with this, is this shift from the crisis of the project, where he draws on a whole, you know, plethora of Marxist, semiological, structuralist, psychoanalytical vocabularies to unlock architecture, to somehow dismantle this idea of a utopian project. That's the crisis of the project. Then there's a project of crisis, where it says, now this has to be turned against itself, because the security that I wanted to somehow dislodge inside architecture has returned as a security of theory. So theory needs to dislodge itself. So theory needs to turn against itself.
It's a bit of a deadlock, isn't it?
Yeah, of course it's a deadlock. But every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. So it depends on how you read. And I think this moment when he wrote this, the project of crisis, is also the moment where something like postmodernism emerged, and he would reject the term. And in his last book about the contemporary period, 1984, the history of Italian architecture, he called it hypermodernity. So there are all these terms for this, and he would not use the term postmodern. But the project of crisis is connected to a whole shift in critical theory, which used to be based in a fairly, let's put it, how should I put it, in a fairly confident way of using Marxist categories, and that became a problem. Can we be really sure about this idea about contradiction and class and all these things? So this theory has to turn against itself, not in order to just destroy itself, but also criticize itself. We cannot remove security from architecture in order to somehow pull it back into theory, because they have the same situation. So I mean, they both need to be dislodged in a kind of ongoing dialectic, and I think so. The movement from crisis to project of crisis is a very crucial one, and it follows the Fullest trajectory, but it also says something about the conjuncture of theory as such. And there's a great book by I picked up this idea from a great book by Italian architecture historian Marco Biraggi. It's called Progetto di Crisi, the project of crisis, and he somehow pinpoints precisely this movement in Tafuri.
All right. And Cacciari, what did he do?
Cacciari came from a different angle. He was a philosopher, and he has gone off in all kinds of directions. But at that time, being the mayor of Venice, of course, you have to face practical problems. You have to face practice in a different way. But in those days, he was involved in something what he called negative thought, and he pensiero negativo, the negative thought, and he said we need to somehow pry apart all these categories that would refer to be positive, substantial. We need to think of nihilism in an infinite way. So there's an English translation of early essays called The Architecture of Nihilism, and this negative thought is like a combination of Adorno, Benjamin, and Heidegger. It's extended further and further out into infinity, and he's even more negative than Tafuri to that extent. Still, even Cacciari in those days, now then he turned to other things, but even in that infinite negativity, there's still a certain pleasure to be found. There's a certain perverse pleasure almost in this infinite negativity, and he goes further than Tafuri. But I mean, he wasn't working in architecture, but on Marxist theory and philosophy. So they work closely together, and so I mean, there's the architecture story and the philosopher. So this was also a very interesting collaboration, which was very fruitful.
And of course, no women were involved.
In those days, I think not. I mean, there are many female scholars of architectural history that have written about this in various angles, but at the time, I don't remember any particular name. This is the late 60s, early 70s.
Of course.
Men did theory and women did the cooking. I mean, that was that's the way it was. So.
Yes. Structure.
But we have a nice essay. I think we will now, I think, republish some of the stuff in the early issue by Riks Högstra, who had a great thesis on Tafuri that we published alongside this interview, I think. So
drag it up from the vault.
There are a lot of historians who actually have worked on this.
Great.
So.